like, I think there was a clear thing about frontline communities were dealing with asthma, and if you were one of those people, you could march. But part of it, I mean, if there was a queer POC frontline group, they would have marched in that part, I would assume.
How did you think about like intersectionality, and was there any conversation around intersectionality as you were both planning the march and the ordering of the folks?
Yeah, there was intersectionality around workers, frontline communities, women, youth, race. I mean, I don't know if there was a conversation about intersectionality around sexual orientation, which is ironic because the two national coordinators are queer. Like Leslie's a lesbian. I'm queer. Like I think that the intersectionality didn't extend to queerness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, this touches on another point that I think was, that Jamie Henn, I had interviewed Jamie Henn earlier I think a couple of weeks ago, and he had mentioned that essentially, and I just wanted to hear what you thought about this, but that it was like you and, part of the infrastructure that you had been a part of and had helped build with like queer politics and queer activists that was partially responsible for the huge mobilization. And just wanted to see your kind of reaction to like, is that how you kind of see it as well?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so Jamie had said that a lot of your prior activism in building like this kind of queer infrastructure was like that y'all used that infrastructure to like mobilize a ton of people to the march in 2014.
Jamie said that about me and Leslie?
I'm pretty sure he definitely mentioned you in terms of like this was like an infrastructure that was activated, but I could not be remembering it correctly.
Infrastructure is infrastructure. It's like, I think it's like not to like, so look, let's just like, the infrastructure that PCM used in DC and for mobilizations is sort of the same infrastructure that the right-wing militias used on January 6th, right? Like, they had a bus program, they had a permit, they had a rally, they moved people from, in some ways there's infrastructure and mobilization infrastructure that you build. I think then there are networks that you tap into. I think the thing for me that I found very interesting that I had not done before, and I think this is partly as a result of digital work, is this idea of issue identity geographic hubs, right? Like, I think again, Leslie would know this. I'm sure this happened in the march in 1982, the nuclear march. There were women against nuclear war, queers against nuclear war. So it didn't happen. It's not new. It's always been an organizing strategy. I would say, I think one of the things what queer organizing, not alone, but I do think ACT UP, in particular, Queer Nation, I think that particularly those organizations, mostly really ACT UP, really was one of the first places, was in our lifetimes, was a place where art and culture and organizing came together and I think influenced. So I don't know about PCM, but at CVH, when I founded CVH, I stole the design from ACT UP, right? Big black blocks, big white letters, very simple slogans that look, on neon paper that looked good. I definitely can trace the connection between ACT UP and my work at CBH. And I think that because art and culture was such an important part of the march, I think you can continue that line that way. But yeah, but I just used organizing, man. I was like, how many people are the unions pushing out? How many people are the faith pushing out? How many people are, how many numbers do we have signed up on the pledge sheets? Like,
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, that's helpful. No. No. Like, I think that's really helpful. And it's good that I asked. So I wanted us to touch on 2017 and what may have been some of the big changes that you saw for the 2017 March, and particularly around the kind of groups, the kind of expansion of groups. Like, I know you mentioned faith and youth groups, but like, what were the big changes
between 2014 and 2017?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it was an evolutionary change, right? Like, so I think in 2015, when we did our National Day of Action, that was really a test. So in 2014, the message was, a lot of people would critique, didn't have a lot of bite, right? It was just like bold climate action, pass the Paris Treaty. We didn't get into the details. People didn't want to get into the details because the minute you got into details, you could break apart the Big Ten. And we talked about racial and economic equity, but to be honest with you, some partners didn't care about racial and economic. 350 cared about racial and economic equity. The EJ groups did, Sierra Club did, but not every group cared about racial and economic equity. And, that continues to be a tension in the climate movement. But in 2015, when we did our National Day of Action, that is where we specifically really focused on, we lifted up and were much more explicit about climate being connected to race, racial equity, economic equity. And I think what was, again, it's like the mobilization that we did it really quickly on almost no money, but what was effective about it and what really moved the White House was that it was unusual suspects in unusual places. It wasn't the traditional white enviros on the coasts. And so, 800 immigrants marching for climate in Seattle, or 3,000 African American, Haitian American, immigrant, Latino, lots of young people of color marching in Miami. Never happened before. Workers, union members, doing actions in the Midwest. So that was an important step. And then I think pivoting off of that. So essentially what we did at PCM was we would do something, we'd evaluate it, and then we'd make a decision, do we do something again based on that? And we did that in 2015. And then after 2015, we said, okay, let's pivot. Let's try to do something around 2016, the first 100 days. Us, like everybody else, thought, let's do a mass mobilization around climate in the first 100 days. We came up with the frame Climate, Jobs, and Justice. This is before Trump. This is like a year before. And we started to build out a platform, which was a lot of hard work, took a lot of time, that I would say, it's funny, it's like 90% of what the Green New Deal is, except it didn't say anything about fossil fuels. And it was a platform. So, but that took a lot of work, and so in 2016, I started building a steering committee that ended up being, so we had the movement support team, which was the kind of operated like the executive committee, but then we had the steering committee, and the steering committee was about 60 groups, ranged in a large number of groups, brought in a lot more traditional enviros, but what people had to do was sign on to the platform, and there was a situation where Greenpeace